All right, this is chapter 10, Making Agriculture Sustainable. This video is only going to be sections 10, 1, 2, and 3. It starts out with a case study about how at the University of Michigan, they started a program where they actually farm food, compost a bunch of food, recycle a bunch of things, kind of make this sustainable food program that the students are a part of, and it was very successful. So you should read that, it's pretty interesting. Then when we turn the page to 242, this first section is about how we feed the world, because it is difficult. There's a lot of people. So this is not actually mentioned in your book, but it's been on the AP exam before, so you should know this. These are the top agricultural products in the world. Number 1 is sugarcane. Number 2 is maize or corn. Number 3 is wheat. 4 is rice, and 5 is potatoes. The top crops in the U.S., which you definitely need to know, I put a star there. So when you see stars, it's like extra important. Number 1 is corn, 2 is soybean, 3 is wheat, and 4 is cotton. Additionally, you should know some of the traditional regional crops that have existed. And these are things that people have traditionally grown for centuries. In Europe, they do winter wheat, rye, and barley. And those are grains that are in bread and beer. Then in Asia, they grow rice. The reason for that is they have the monsoons that we talked about last unit. And they cause the fields to flood, and rice is only grown in flooded fields. In North America, like up there, corn and wheat are regional crops. In Africa, corn and sugarcane. And then in Central and South America, it is also corn and wheat. So we are producing more food per person. You should know this term, food security, which is this idea that everybody has enough food to eat and they know where their next meal is coming from. You should know the terms undernourished, which means you don't get enough calories. You should know the term overnourished or overnutrition. It means you have too many calories. And then malnutrition can be either of these things, or it could be that you have enough food, but you don't have foods in the right ratios, or you're missing certain vitamins and minerals. So you should know some of the diseases that come from lacking some of these things. One of these is kwashiorkor. It's under this bullet actually, and that is when you are low in protein. And it leads to a lot of those things that you see in children in developing countries where they have the distended belly, and immune suppression and developmental delays and things like that. If this protein deficiency is along with undernourishment, then it can lead to something called marasmus, which causes millions of children around the world to die every year. So that's this one here, marasmus. You should also know scurvy. Historically, that's something that people have worried about on ships, Navy, and things like that. It's a lack of vitamin C, causes swollen gums, loose teeth, and things like that. So there are a lot of diseases that come from deficiencies. Vitamin A deficiency can lead to blindness. It's another one that you should know. Then when we turn this page, there's this graphic here that you should look at. It's not super important. Talks a little bit about how agriculture has changed over time. We used to be hunter-gatherers, and then somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years ago, agriculture developed independently all over the world. And we kind of stayed at subsistence level farming where people grew their own food for thousands of years. And then in the Middle Ages, somewhere around there, people started to specialize. And so you might be a blacksmith and you traded your services for food from the farmer and so on. That was really the last big change in how we grow food until something called the Green Revolution. We talked previously when we looked at the nitrogen cycle about the Haber-Bosch process. And so the Green Revolution began in the 1940s when the Haber-Bosch process was discovered. It increased agricultural productivity enormously, but it also increased fossil fuel use and synthetic fertilizer use, synthetic pesticide use, and water irrigation. So there are definitely pros and cons to this, and it starts right here about the Green Revolution. And then when you turn the page, you'll see this picture of this guy, Norman Borlaug. He is considered the father of the Green Revolution. You should know his name. That picture is famous. Anytime they mention him, that's the picture they use. But I have like a pluses and minuses or benefits and drawbacks to the Green Revolution. One is that it did save countries from starvation. Countries like India, where the population was growing and they couldn't grow enough food to feed them, it saved millions of people's lives. It reduced poverty. People were able to grow enough crops to where they were actually able to sell them at a profit. No new land was needed for farming because they were increasing the yield. That's a term you should know. Yield is how much food you get per acre of land. So as they were increasing the yield, they didn't need to convert new land to farming. They were able to just get more yield off the land that they had. But more land, then that means that more land and habitat is saved for wildlife. On the drawback side, there's water pollution from the fertilizer and pesticides. We talked about eutrophication in a previous unit. There is loss of biodiversity in crops and livestock because certain things are easier to grow, and so people will grow those things to the exclusion of others. Certain types of livestock are easier to grow, and they will grow those to the exclusion of others. This means there is actually less nutrition because there is a lack of variety. And then there's increased air pollution. The Green Revolution did rely on industrialization of farming, tractors, threshers, combines, all of those kinds of things put fossil fuels, they run on fossil fuels and they put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then the nitrates that are sprayed in the fertilizer also go up into the air. Over here on page 247, you should know the term sustainable agriculture. We've talked a lot about sustainability. This is just agriculture that replenishes the soil and doesn't degrade it. You should know both of these figures and captions. This one right here talks about monoculture, which is the idea that you are only growing one thing over and over again, which is efficient for planting and harvesting, but they're susceptible to outbreaks of pests and they deplete the soil of certain minerals that then need to be replenished, which could be replenished through crop rotation if you grew something else. Then we get to section 10.2, which is about raising animals for food. And this is where a lot of people get touchy. Some people love meat and they don't want to hear anything bad about it. Some people are vegetarians and they're totally on board with all meat is bad. But it's like everything, you know, it depends. So here, this graph shows you the total meat production. This is meat production. This is meat per person. So we are producing more meat, but the meat per person is going down because the population of the earth is growing so fast. Eating meat does affect the environment more because, as you remember from our trophic levels, we lose 90% of the energy in the plants as they are fed to the animals as you go up that trophic level. So therefore, we need, on average, 10 times more land, pesticide, fertilizer, and fossil fuels to grow the same amount of calories of meat versus if we just ate the plants. So that's something that you should definitely know. Consumption of animal products is growing. People around the world want the American or Western lifestyle, and that means eating a lot of meat. A lot on these next few pages. You should know this figure and caption. It shows you basically that producing different animal food products requires different amounts of feed. So before we said 90%, but actually for a cow, it's 95% is lost. It takes 20 kilograms of feed to make 1 kilogram of beef. 7.3 for cow or pigs, so it's like about 3 times better. But as you start going down, milk, chicken, eggs, those are much more efficient in terms of protein for input. You should know here that livestock pollute the air with methane. And then there's nitric oxide and CO2. And these are all like animal waste products, and they all contribute to climate change. And so it talks a little bit about that in here about diet having consequence for climate change. So make sure you know that. And then in animal agriculture, there's a lot of air pollution. In that air pollution, there's smell. If you've lived near a feedlot, you would know. If you live near a chicken farm, you would know. Nitrous oxide is one of the air pollutants. And then the greenhouse gases that I talked about over here, it's important to note that greenhouse gases are not considered air pollution. It's a separate category. There is also surface and groundwater pollution. nitrogen and phosphorus, talked about eutrophication, bacteria and viruses from the waste. The feed, they have these animals, and I'll talk about these pictures in a minute, but they have these animals like in these pens, and there's just so many of them, and they're just eating and pooping, and they're producing so much waste. Oftentimes, if it rains really heavily, that waste will run into the rivers, nearby water sources. Bacteria and viruses from the waste products will get into the water. They're crowded, and so this leads to an overuse of antibiotics to keep the animals healthy. And when you overuse antibiotics, it causes antibiotic resistance, which I personally consider one of the, probably the most important environmental issue facing us today. So they just give it to them as a preventative measure, even though they're not sick. And that really leads to the antibiotic resistance. Up here, you should know this figure and caption. It talks about the land required to produce 1 kilogram of protein, the water required to produce 1 kilogram of protein, and the greenhouse gas emissions released in producing 1 kilogram of protein. And you can see in every one of these, cows are just the worst, which is a shame, I think. But then we have the pork, which is a little bit, it's still not great, but then you look again at the milk, eggs, and chicken, and they are much lower. So you should know that these are, the relative amounts to produce each type of protein. And then this is showing a cattle feedlot and a chicken farm, or they call it a chicken factory farm. You should know about feedlots and factory farms, and these are just pens where they keep animals and they just feed them. They're not out on a range. They don't have really a lot of space to move around. They just get fed and they just eat and they go to the bathroom and they grow and then they're slaughtered. So this is factory farming, and a lot of people are against it. Then when we turn the page, it starts talking about lab-grown meat. Lab-grown meat is muscle fibers that are grown in the lab, and people are working on trying to see if this could be a solution to the demand for meat without the raising of animals. This is different from something like the Beyond Burger or something like that, because those are plant-based. Then we switch over to aquaculture, which is fish farming. And so you should know what aquaculture is. And there are benefits and drawbacks to aquaculture as well. And you should read that and know what those are. Then we get to section 10.3, which is about controlling pests and weeds. And up here, they talk about how pests and weeds are really just a matter of opinion. Something could be beneficial somewhere, and then if it's not beneficial somewhere else, it's a pest. So it's really about, does it benefit you in that location? A weed is just a plant that is competing with a crop. It's growing where it's not desired. An orchid or a rose bush or something could be a weed if it's growing among a corn crop. Then we get to how we have developed thousands of chemical pesticides. And what does it mean to be a pesticide? Well, there's different kinds. Pesticide just means it's killing something that is considered a pest. We have insecticides, which kill bugs. We have herbicides, which kill weeds. Those are plant weeds. And then fungicides, which kill fungus. But all of those kind of are collectively termed pesticides. This is a billion-dollar business in the U.S. Then this page is very full, all right? You should know, this does say pesticides boost food production, but there are drawbacks. There are synthetic pesticides. You should know some of these. Synthetic means that they are man-made from chemicals. Strychnine is an example. DDT is an example. DDT was banned, I think in the 70s. I'd have to look that up to be sure, but it was banned because it was getting into the environment and causing birds' eggshells to be very thin. And when the birds sat on their nest, they crushed their eggs, and it was killing off generations of birds. Chlorinated hydrocarbons are another type of synthetic pesticide. These are considered to be the worst pesticides. They're made from petroleum, and they cause birth defects. And then another category of pesticide is a broad spectrum pesticide. What that means, broad spectrum, means like it covers a lot. And so these actually kill a wide variety of insects, including good insects that we like bees, which are pollinators. You should know this figure, okay? And it talks about it in this paragraph here too. This picture is what's called the pesticide treadmill, or the evolutionary arms race. So you have pests attacking crops. They apply a pesticide. Some of them die, but because of natural mutations, biodiversity, some of them do not. And so these live to breed and survive. And now your entire region is filled with just the ones that are resistant to the pesticide that you applied. And so then you have to apply a new, stronger pesticide. And so the cycle is constantly going on where the genetics of the population is changing because of the pesticides that were applied. When you get to the next page, though, they talk about how there are biological controls that you can use. And there are some classic examples of this. The cactus moth, this picture is here. It was a success. They introduced the cactus moth to eradicate the invasive cactus species that were growing in Australia, and you can see that it worked. There's also Bt bacteria, which is a soil Bacillus thuringiensis. Bt is naturally occurring soil bacteria, and it produces a protein that is non-toxic to people but kills a lot of caterpillars and fly and beetle larvae. And so you can spray the spores on your crops and it will kill off the pest naturally because it's a naturally occurring bacterium. You should know some drawbacks to biocontrol because they can themselves become pests. If you watched the cane toads movie, you know what happened. They were brought in to kill off the cane beetle and they didn't, and they themselves became pests. So you have to do lots of studies and be very careful before you introduce a biological control, or it itself might become invasive. Then when we turn the page here to the last one in this section, the best pesticides for health and environment are the Bt bacteria that I was just talking about, something called a braconid wasp. These wasps are actually carnivores and they eat other bugs. So if you can introduce them into the area, sometimes they'll kill off the bugs that you want to get rid of. Insecticidal soap is just, it kind of traps them in there and they can't fly and they die from that. And then the soap kind of just washes off. It's not toxic to people. Or toxic plant derivatives are sometimes, like if you think about something like poison ivy, it has a toxin in it. Poison ivy is not something that we would use to spray on crops, but other plants put out other toxins that can kill things off, and we can use plant derivatives to get rid of bugs or other types of weeds. Then the last thing in section 10.3 that you should know is IPM, which is Integrated Pest Management. This is super important. It talks about how it prevents the pesticide treadmill. And you should know some of the techniques up here in this top paragraph. But basically it means not relying on one thing to control your pests. Using a variety of things, maybe at the same time, or maybe one after the other so that they aren't able to develop a resistance to it. So it could be habitat alteration, crop rotation, biological control, mechanical pest removal, and some judicious pesticide spraying. But you do this in conjunction so that the pests don't have the ability to evolve a resistance to whatever you're using. All right, 10.4 through 10.6 will be in the next video.